So, as you can hear from the introduction, my field of expertise is not early recordings. I'm just first starting on this path now, so this is new research. Much more used to talking about music and politics in the post-Stalinist period. But I was saying to Barbara before as well, there's actually a kind of invisible link, because the recording industry sprung up in Russia during what's usually called the Silver Age of Russian culture. It's usually applied to literature and poetry. And that loomed large in the cultural imagination of the post-war period. So there is a sort of invisible link there, perhaps. I'd also say that I've always been interested in listening to early recordings. In the house where I grew up, we inherited a cabinet gramophone from what was my great-grandfather and his shellac disc collection. So it's always been part of something I've been interested in. And I should say thanks to Eva Moreira Rodriguez, who I'm sure a lot of you know, who first introduced me to the Early Recording Association and encouraged me to have a look at this. So, and thanks also to Barbara and Inya for having me here to speak. So today I'll talk about the Russian recording industry in the late Imperial period, just before the revolution. The period roughly from 1910 to 17 is what I'm looking at the moment. And I'm looking at it through the lens of the periodicals that were published, in particular one called Gramophony Mir, which means Gramophone World. But first, a little bit of context. The Russian recording industry expanded rapidly in the first years of the 20th century. And although the phonograph had appeared in Russia at the end of the 19th century, Alexander Tikhonov has suggested that 1902 can be regarded as the actual beginning of the Russian gramophone industry. It's in 1902 that in St. Petersburg, the first Russian company producing records and record players, called V.I. Arebikov and Company, was opened. It's also noteworthy that this company came into being almost simultaneously with the record manufacturing companies Gramophone and Zonophone, which were founded on foreign investments in Russia. It's also in 1902 that the first issue of the specialized magazine devoted to problems of the new industry, Gramophone and Phonograph, it was published. Also in 1902, the voice of Shaliapin, probably the most famous Russian singer of the day, was first recorded in Russia. And the same year marked the first scandal that Tikhonov calls it, gramophone scandal, centered around Anastasia Vyaltseva. I think he's referring to this idea of pirate recordings that very quickly followed the establishment of the recording industry. And it's not on the slide, but also 1902 was the first public gramophone concert that took place in Russia. The first record distributors opened, retail and wholesale record stores appeared, and in Tikhonov's words, the gramophone starts its triumphant march over Russia. So if 1902 can be taken as the starting point, 1910 can probably be the point by which we could say it was really firmly established and firmly consolidated in Russia, in Imperial Russia. And as Karina Zybina has observed, that by 1910, there were around 80 recording companies active in Russia. And moreover, it was vocal music and opera excerpts, songs, romances, and Russian folk songs in particular that constituted by far the greatest part of these productions. This early boom in the Russian record industry coincided with, and I would say contributed to, the rise of operatic celebrity, notably Nikolai and Medea Figner, who had both worked closely with Tchaikovsky, the tenor Leonid Sabanov, and perhaps most famously Shaliapin, who I've already mentioned. And later on I'll be talking about a less well-known figure called Alexander Davidov. And another major consequence, which is my focus, is this emergence of periodicals, magazines, and so on, dedicated to the recording industry. And the primary ones of the pre-revolutionary period you can see listed on this slide. So you have Gramophony Phonograph, as already mentioned. That existed for between 1902 and 1906 and went through a couple of name changes. It changed its name first to Sviet i Zvuk, which means light and sound, and then changed its name to Gramophone and Photography. You also have Gramophone News, the next one down, run 1907 to 8. The official news, or the official publication of the Gramophone Company, which later changed its name to Pishushi Amor, which basically means love of recording, recording amour. And then, as I've highlighted there, Grammophony Mir, which is the longest running one and the one that I've started focusing on in this research, 1910 to 1917. That's the front cover of the second edition, published in April 1910, you can see there. Grammophone Жизнь, Gramophone Life, was a short-lived rival to Grammophony Mir, quite an acrimonious rivalry between those two. And then finally, Pishushi Amor, which I don't think is related to the other Pishushi Amor. It's very confusing, but... So, let's move to the next bit of text I've got here. Dmitry Bogемsky, he's the editor of Grammophony Mir. He's the first figure that I'm introducing today. He was born Dmitry Anisimovich Berkovich. He was Ukrainian. He was a Ukrainian Jew from Kherson in the Ukraine. He first made his living writing humorous stories, poems, couplets, and so on for newspapers and humor magazines like Budilnik, Shut, and Oskolki. And I should say that Bogemsky is a pseudonym that he adopted, and ski is a very common suffix in Slavic surnames, but it's also an adjectival ending in Russian. So Bogemsky literally means Bohemian, so that name could be read as Bohemian Dmitry. So it's a sort of joke name. And he also had several other joke names he wrote under, which were sometimes lampooning famous Russian writers. So he had one parodying Lev Tolstoy, which was Count Khudoy. Tolstoy means, sort of thick or fat in Russian, and Khudoy means thin or skinny. So Count Tolstoy becomes Count Skinny. And similarly, you have Maxim Gorky. If you know that Gorky means bitter, you can guess that Maxim Sladky means Maxim Sugary or Maxim Sweet. So he was writing under these, very typical of his kind of humour at that time. With the development of commercial recordings, Bogemsky turned his comic stories into sketches, audio sketches, which he recorded to rolls for Richard Jakob, the German, who was a German entrepreneur who owned one of the first recording companies in Moscow. I think he could basically figured he could make money quicker and make more of it by recording his sketches directly rather than trying to get them published in various newspapers. He became a very successful recording artist actually in his own right. There's a little statistic here that phonograph rolls sold at 1.5 rubles, which would be, say, 150 kopecks. And a recording artist at that time, when Bogemsky first started recording for Richard Jakob, would get 20 to 40 kopecks of that 150 kopecks. So it's quite a small cut, but average around 20, just under 20%. He was exiled in 1905, after the revolution of 1905, to Chisinau in Moldova, most likely because of his lampoons of Russian aristocratic society, which didn't go down well in the wake of a revolutionary movement. But by 1908, he was able to return to Russia, and he settled in St. Petersburg, where he recorded his comic sketches and humorous couplets for numerous recording companies. 1910, then, he became the editor, he was invited to be the editor of a new publication, which was Grammophony Mir, as I've already said, the longest running of the pre-revolutionary periodicals. It was published in Russian and German, dual translation. You can see here on this slide, you have both an advert for, it says, "You must subscribe to our periodical. It's in your interest," both in German and in Russian. But obviously, 1914 changed all that for obvious reasons, and Germans became very unpopular in Russian in 1914. Full year subscription was 5 rubles, half year 3 rubles, and it was packed with adverts. Bogemsky even advertised in his own journal for people to advertise in his journal, if that makes sense. Saying, try advertising with our magazine, you'll get the most brilliant results. And at the top of this as well, you also have this dvustronaya plastinka, these double-sided records, the new thing. And if I just go back a couple of slides, you have this advert for Zonophon, the recording company, who are producing the best double-sided records, apparently. And it's also worth pointing out that this figure that you see here, this logo in the gramophone horn, is Maria Yemskaya, who is Bogemsky's wife and a soprano and recording artist in her own right. So he used it as a platform to kind of promote his own interests and his family's interests as much as he did to talk about the record industry. Good. So typical contents might involve opinion pieces, industry news, record reviews, repertoire lists, letters and comments, all sorts of things you'd expect from a periodical then and now, really. It also had a comic section, typical of Bogiemski's kind of humour, which, even if it's not always that funny to our ears today, is quite revealing in terms of its attitudes towards social class and taste, because what gets made fun of in jokes is often quite reflective of what people think, how they consume new inventions and new cultures. So just a few of these I've highlighted, I can just read out. The first one is saying, what's your social status? And the reply comes back, I like to play gramophones at merchant weddings. Yeah? So already in association with the gramophone and it being this kind of middle-class, bourgeois, slightly tasteless thing. Second one that I've highlighted, would you like to insure yourself against fire? Then the reply comes back, no, we have a new mutual insurance company against suicide resulting from the tediousness of country house gramophones. Yeah? And finally, at the bottom, have you heard they're selling gramophones cheap on Sadovaya Street? Thanks, but I'm used to burning real birchwood in my stove. So, you know, lampooning this, I think the thing you can draw from that it's also a commentary on taste and consumption, the idea that it's this kind of bourgeois, tasteless apparatus. And there's actually plenty of articles published within Gramophonie about what Tikhonov calls these issues of concern, and one of the main issues of concern is the struggling of the Russian record industry at that time. So there's an article, I think it might be in the very first edition, or possibly the second edition, which is entitled, Who's to Blame? So why is the German record industry dominating and doing so well? Why are we failing so poorly here? And there's a mixture of arguments. Some saying, oh, it's the problem of our provincial backwaters, these uncultured places outside Petersburg and Moscow, where you have provincial sellers who don't really understand the product they're selling, they don't know how to sell it, and then people consuming it aren't cultured enough to consume these things properly. And then on the other side, you say, well, there's a snobbishness attached to the upper classes, the aristocracy have a snobbishness associated with it, similar to those jokes that we had a moment ago, saying that this is a lower class bourgeois or tasteless thing. There's a story that Yemskaya asked Bogiemski, oh, how come we don't have these automatic record players that they have in public spaces in Germany? And Bogiemski said, well, we couldn't. They'd get wrecked as soon as anyone discovered they were there, essentially. So it's, again, a commentary on the fact that Russia was not yet cultured enough to consume this in some respects. There are also these legal and ethical problems, which I think are what I'm most interested in, really. And this is about the relationship of someone's voice being intellectual property in the same way as like a text or a composition might be, something written down. One of the articles in the second edition, the writer, it's called In Defense of Singers, and the writer says, in the new copyright law, and this was something that was being considered in St. Petersburg by the city council, the interests of composers are protected. The draft law states that the composer has the exclusive right for a given period to reproduce his work on gramophone records. Translated into monetary terms, this means that the composer will receive royalties for each disc featuring his music. But what about the singers? Frankly, I consider the role of the singer in the gramophone industry immeasurably more important than the role of the composer. So it's obviously a hardline argument in favour and in defence of singers, he says. But it was raising this question of the fact that singers got paid for the record they produced, but they didn't get royalties in the same way that they might have got in other countries or at slightly later dates. So this is a similar concern that lay behind Alexander Davidov's reported attempt to form his own record company that was run by artists and singers rather than by businessmen, to protect the interests of the artists, basically. So I'll just introduce him first, and then I'll talk about this idea of his. He was actually born Israel Moisevich Levinson in Kobylyaki, which is near Poltava in Ukraine. So, like Bogiemski, he was also a Ukrainian Jew. His early career, he sung in a choir in Sevastopol from age 12. He worked as a stevedore whilst being an extra in the Odessa Opera, so, a man of many talents. From 1889, he was the lead singer at the Kiev Café Chantant called Chateau de Fleurs. He joined the Kiev Opera Theatre. His first solo role was in the Kiev premiere of Queen of Spades by Tchaikovsky. But it wasn't as Herman, who you can see him dressed as Herman on the slide, as he became known for later on in life. And he debuted lead roles in Yekaterinoslav, which is the old name for Dnipro. He was Faust in Faust, and Alfredo in La Traviata. That was in 1889. And I think that later on as well, La Traviata tells you what was popular in the Russian canon, because Bogemski actually also recorded a comic sketch that's typical of his, this early 20th century sort of Jewish, self-referential Jewish vaudeville type of comedy that he was part of, called La Traviata as retold by a Jew. So it's something that he was also sort of playing with. So his breakthrough was as a solo. He had a brief stint in operetta because he thought he could make more money, and then realised that he couldn't, and then he went back to opera, and played these very well-known tenor roles like the Duke and Count Almaviva and so on. So his breakthrough was at the Mariinsky in 1900, and again this was Tchaikovsky, Queen of Spades, but this time as Hermann, in the lead role as Hermann. He retired from opera, the operatic stage, in 1914 because he started losing his hearing, sadly. But he continued to sing chamber music, romances and sort of salon romances, and also some gypsy songs, which are very, well, as they were called, cyganska piesne, and folk songs, narodne piesne. And he was a really prolific recording artist. I've got here over 400 gramophone records between 1901 and 1912. Some estimates that I've read put that at 600, but what I would like to do in the future is try and get lists, catalogues of his recordings and see if I can actually verify what he actually recorded and when. So just to give you a quick break from my voice, you can hear the much more melodious tones of Davidoff for a minute.
Покой, прости нас разного, не отвергай признания, не отвергай состой. О, пожалей, я, умирая, несу в тебе мою мольбу. Гляни с высот небесных рая на смертную борьбу души, терзаной мучением любви к тебе.
So his voice is often described in the very few references. Yeah, that's fine. I'm just on my last couple of slides. Yeah, as light and as not as intense as some of his contemporaries. So I'd like to look into more about that kind of reception of his voice if I can find any. Oh, that's the Château de Flore. It was sort of pleasure gardens. It's where the Dynamo Stadium was built on top of it in 1933, I think. So, protecting singers' voices. He's at the centre of this attempt to protect operatic singers from exploitation of their voices. This was mocked, really, in the press by Julius von Knorring, who I think is German. I mean, it's published in German and Russian, but then I was just reading Three Sisters by Chekhov, and there's a character called Tusenbach who says, "You probably think I'm a sentimental German, but I'm not, I'm Russian." So I maybe shouldn't leap to conclusions about his nationality. So I've just got a few quotes from it to finish. He says, well known to the gramophone world, the artist of the Imperial Mariinsky Opera, Alexander Davidov, wanted to get rich quick and become the head director of a large joint stock enterprise. So he says he gathered all these singers around him. The effusive artists buzzed and made a great noise, and a minute later imagined themselves as directors of the largest joint stock enterprise. In their sweet dreams, German factories were going down the drain with stunning rapidity, and their main competitor, the joint stock company Gramophone, crawled in the dust before them, praying in vain, "Have mercy, my darlings, don't ruin us. We're suffering not a little without you." And then, as if from a cornucopia, gold pours forth and the artists are drowned in a mighty jingling wave. Well, why not sometimes sip tea and dream of all sorts of stupidities? So it's very much the idea that an artist could take control of their own voice and have that protected was mocked. It was seen as ludicrous, at least by von Knorring. And he says, I say with confidence that since artists and not businessmen are at the head of this business, then it is worthless. And anyone who knows the industry knows how much expertise you need in this field, basically. And the sad fact clearly shows that for every 100 records, there are at most a dozen operatic recordings, which is interesting to me because, you know, as Zibner suggested, you know, operatic excerpts made up a large part of it. Maybe von Knorring is being rhetorical, trying to downplay what this is, but it'd be interesting to actually do a survey and see how many operatic recordings there were, and if I can find any information about how popular they were. And so finally, the main thing that an artist's calling is to this the artist's calling is to the stage and not to the hustle and bustle of commerce. The best proof of that is that in Russia, there's not even one single theatre run by a collective of artists. And if in small towns they make any attempt to form a collective theatre, then the matter usually ends up with justice of the peace for mutual physical insults to the face and other parts of the body. So, you know, a little insight into the brutality of sort of early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century criticism there as well. Anyway, this is, forgive me for the lack of strong conclusions here, so it's just, like I say, early stages, and I've got a lot of work still to do. What I want to do is continue reading through these back issues, looking in particular for attitudes towards copyright and intellectual artistic property, piracy, exploitation, and so on. I've said until 1917, but I would also be very interested in seeing how this continues and changes post-revolution, obviously with the idea of an artist collective not being quite so ludicrous in the Soviet era. Davidov materials, I'd like to continue talking about him as a Ukrainian Jewish tenor who is not very well known but was very popular in his day. I find it very difficult to find any online references to him. I have seen some reference to a memoirs written by his wife, which I might be able to track down, but archival research prospects are not good given the war that's ongoing. But he did spend some time with Shaliapin in France, so I might be able to find something there. We'll see. But apart from that, thank you very much.